The autumn of 1887 had not been kind to the Blackwater Creek settlement, but it had been especially merciless to Louisa Brennan. She had 4 days of salted pork left in the smokehouse, a half-barrel of oats with a crack running up its side that let the frost in at night, and one 7-year-old boy named Percy who... She caught herself. Not Percy. She had named him Thomas after his father, though she had stopped calling him that the day Thomas Sr. failed to come home from the logging camp and never did. She called the boy Kit now. It was easier. Kit was sleeping when she heard it. Louisa was outside splitting kindling in the gray November dark, the kind of dark that arrived at 3:30 in the afternoon in the Alberta foothills and did not apologize for itself. She was 24 years old and moved like someone 10 years older. Her shoulders already shaped by the particular hunch of a woman who carried everything alone. The axe was too heavy for her wrists. She used it anyway. She heard the creak before she saw anything wrong. The Blackwater ran shallow and fast behind the property line, and in freeze-up season it made a sound like glass being ground between two stones. But this was different. Something disrupting the current. Something large, catching on the rocks downstream. Her first thought was a moose. They came down from the high timber when the snow pushed them low, stumbling and thin-flanked, confused by the smell of wood smoke and human settlement. She set the axe against the chopping block and walked toward the sound, pulling her shawl tight with both fists. It was not a moose. The man was face down in the shallows, one arm hooked around a deadfall log that had kept him from going under entirely. He was enormous. Even crumpled against the current, he looked like something felled, like an old-growth pine brought down in a storm. His coat was oilskin and canvas, frontier-made and blood-soaked through, the dark stain spreading out into the water around him in slow, terrible ribbons. Louisa stopped at the bank. Every reasonable thought she had ever possessed told her to go back inside. The settlement had no doctor, no constable within 30 miles, and a woman alone with a child did not involve herself with bleeding men she did not know. The frontier rewarded caution. She had learned that when Thomas died, and again 3 months later when his business partner arrived at her door, claiming Thomas had borrowed $200 he had never mentioned to her, and she had no way to prove otherwise. The man in the creek made a sound. Not a word. Just a rough, rattling exhale that said, plainly, that he was still in there somewhere, and the cold was working hard to change that. "Lord, give me strength," Louisa said, which was the closest thing to a prayer she had left. She waded in up to her knees. The cold hit like a hammer blow to the bone. She grabbed his coat collar with both hands and pulled. He did not move. She braced her heels against a submerged rock, leaned back until her spine was nearly parallel with the water, and pulled again. This time he came, grudgingly, inch by inch, the current releasing him like it resented losing him. It took her the better part of an hour to get him to the cabin. She could not carry him. She dragged him, stopping every 20 yards to catch her breath and look back at the darkness beyond the tree line, half expecting to see riders coming through it. Once, she thought she did see something, a shape, a stillness that was too deliberate to be wind-moved branches. She kept moving. Kit was awake when she came through the door. He was sitting up in the trundle bed with his knees pulled to his chest, watching her with the particular solemn attention of a child who had learned not to ask too many questions. "Who is he?" Kit said. "I don't know yet," Louisa said. "Help me with his legs." Kit was small for 7, but he was earnest about it, bracing himself against the doorframe and pulling with everything he had. Together they got the man inside. He left a trail across the floorboards that Louisa would be scrubbing for days. She built the fire up hotter than she could afford and stripped off his coat and shirt with the sewing shears. The wounds were bad. 2 of them, both from a rifle, not a pistol, she could tell by the width. One had gone clean through his left side, tearing muscle but missing anything vital. The other was lodged high in his right shoulder, and from the way his breathing hitched and rattled on that side, She suspected the ball had clipped the edge of something it should not have touched. She had delivered calves by firelight. She had set Kit's broken arm the winter before, after he fell from the hayloft, with nothing but a straight branch and torn sheeting and her own nerve to guide her. She was not a medical woman. She was just the only person here. She sterilized a needle and Thomas's pocket knife in the coals. She used the last of the medical-grade grain alcohol she had been hoarding since spring. When she poured it over the wound in his shoulder, the man came half-conscious and arched so hard off the floor that she had to put her whole weight on his chest to keep him down. He roared. It was not a human sound in any familiar sense. Kit pressed himself into the corner and covered his ears. "I know," Louisa said to the man, to Kit, to herself. "I know. Hold still." The ball was deep. She worked for 40 minutes before the improvised forceps caught against it, and when it finally came free, she sat back on her heels and shook so hard, she dropped it twice before getting it into the basin. She packed and bound the wound and sat beside him while the fever came, which it did by midnight, rolling in like weather. He was delirious through most of the night. He talked, but not in a way that made immediate sense. Fragments, names she didn't know, and then twice a phrase that made her go very still. The survey documents. Don't let Haverstock get the survey documents. She knew that name. Everett Haverstock owned the mill at Dunmore Crossing, 6 miles east, and the general store and the livery, and the 2 largest claims along the upper Blackwater. He had been pressuring the smaller homesteaders to sell their creek-front lots for 2 years. He had shown up at Louisa's door in September with a folded document he claimed was evidence that Thomas had taken on a lien against the property before he died, a lien that now belonged to Haverstock's holding company, and that the interest had grown to a sum she could not possibly pay. She had not signed anything, but she knew she was running out of reasons not to. She looked at the man on her floor. His coat had an interior pocket. Inside it she found a canvas document case, oil-treated, sealed with a brass clasp. She told herself she was only looking to find out who he was. That was partly true. His name was written inside the front cover of the survey ledger. Callum Briggs, Land Surveyor, Dominion Lands Branch, Government of Canada. She read for 2 hours by the firelight while Kit leapt, and Callum Briggs burned with fever at her feet. What she found in those pages was not what she had expected. It was worse, in the way that truth is often worse than suspicion, more specific, more damning, and harder to unknow. Haverstock had been manipulating the water allocation records for the Blackwater tributary since 1884. He had filed falsified survey claims with the Dominion Lands Office in Edmonton, shifting the documented course of the creek on paper. Just enough, just 200 yards, to place the primary water access legally on land he controlled, while the homesteaders downstream, including Louisa, went on drawing from a source they no longer legally owned according to documents they had never been shown. Callum Briggs had figured it out, had ridden up from Calgary with the original government survey maps rolled in that canvas case, intending to confront Haverstock with the discrepancy before filing his report. Haverstock had sent men to intercept him on the North Trail. She closed the ledger carefully and set it back in the case. She sat for a long time looking at the fire. Then she got up and she put the case behind the loose stone in the chimney flank, the one Thomas had always meant to re-mortar and never had, and she wedged it tight and set the firewood back against the wall in front of it. 3 days passed. The fever broke on the second morning. On the third day, Callum Briggs opened his eyes with something like proper clarity in them and tried to sit up, which immediately showed him that this was not a thing his body was going to permit. He was younger than she had expected. She had not been able to tell in the dark and the emergency of it, but in the pale winter light from the east window she could see that he was perhaps 28 or 30, lean-faced, with the kind of weathering that came from working outside for years. He had a healed scar along his left forearm, and the hands of someone who used them for more than ledger work. He looked at her. He looked around the cabin. He looked at Kit, who was sitting on the floor eating oatmeal with great concentration. "You pulled me out of the creek," he said. His voice was rough from the fever. "You were slowing the current down," Louisa said. Something in his expression shifted like he was recalculating. "Callum Briggs," he said. "Louisa Brennan," she said. "And that's Kit. Eat something before you talk. You've earned the right to be ungrateful later, but not yet." She had expected him to ask about the document case immediately. He didn't. He ate the broth she brought him with the careful determination of a man who understood that his body was the only tool he had, and he needed to maintain it. He thanked Kit very gravely when Kit brought him a second portion. Kit was enormously pleased by this and stood 3 inches taller for the rest of the day. It was that evening, after Kit had fallen asleep, that Callum looked at her from the rocking chair where he had managed to relocate himself and said, "You read the ledger." "I did," Louisa said. She was darning a sock. She did not stop. "The document case, behind the chimney stone, the loose one to the left." He exhaled slowly. "You're either very trusting or very intelligent." "I'm neither," Louisa said. "I'm practical. If you were one of Haverstock's men, you wouldn't have been bleeding in my creek. You'd have been the one doing the shooting." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had come up from the northwest the way it did in November, a steady, purposeful cold that meant business. "He's been after your land," Callum said. "Since September? Your water access is the reason. The Blackwater runs deep on your quarter section. There's an underground feed from the limestone shelf above. It doesn't show on the falsified maps, but it shows on the originals." He shifted, wincing. "If Haverstock controls your access, he controls the only reliable water supply in this valley for 20 miles east. The CPR is surveying an extension line through here next spring. A water source this consistent, they'd pay significant money for the rights." Louisa set down the sock. The Canadian Pacific Railway, of course. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the lung fever the town doctor had called it, the way it had come on sudden and savage in April, the way a man who had spent 10 years farming in weather that would kill an unprepared man had simply stopped in the space of a week. She thought of Haverstock arriving in September with the lien document. She thought of the timeline of it. "Thomas didn't borrow money from Haverstock," she said. "It was not a question." "No," Callum said carefully. "Not according to anything in the Dominion records." "He wouldn't have," she said it quietly. "He knew what that man was. He'd told me twice in the winter before he died that Haverstock was buying people out under pressure, that he'd never sell this lot, never." She stopped. "He was going to write to the land office in Edmonton." Callum looked at her steadily. The realization arrived not like a blow but like cold water, the way real things arrive. Slowly at first, and then entirely. Thomas's fever had been like no illness she had ever seen move through a man. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Gunnardson, had said the same. "Too fast," she had said, touching Louisa's arm at the grave. "Too fast not for a strong man." Louisa stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark. She did not cry. She had no tears left that were news to her. She had been grieving Thomas for 8 months. But the shape of the grief changed in that moment. It became something harder and more specific, and in that hardness she felt something she had not felt since April. She felt angry. She turned around. "How long until you can ride?" Callum Briggs looked at her for a moment with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something that looked like it might become respect if she gave it time. "A week," he said. "Maybe less. Then you'll stay a week," Louisa said. "And in that week I need to know everything that's in those documents, every discrepancy, every false filing, every name." She held his gaze. "Because when you ride to Edmonton, I'm going to write a letter to accompany your report, and I need to make sure there is not a single fact in it that Haverstock can dispute." He nodded once, slowly. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Louisa," she corrected. "Louisa." He said it with the deliberate care of a man storing something for later use. "What he did, tell your husband, that's not in my surveying brief. I can document the land fraud, the water records, the falsified maps. But murder, If that's what this was, that's a matter for the Northwest Mounted Police. I know what it is, Louisa said. I know what I need to prove it and what I don't. I didn't ask you to solve it for me. She picked the sock back up. I asked you to eat your broth and get well. The rest will work out. The week that followed had a particular quality that Louisa had no good word for. It was busy in a way that felt almost like being alive again. Callum was not an easy patient in the sense that he refused to remain one. By the fourth day, he was on his feet, helping Kit split the lighter kindling, moving carefully but moving, his good arm steady on the axe and his eyes sharp. He talked to Kit without condescension, which Kit responded to like a plant responds to light. He explained to the boy, very seriously, how to read a topographic map, and Kit sat for an entire afternoon with the flat survey drawings spread on the floor, asking questions with the methodical intensity of a child who understood that he was being treated as intelligent and intended to prove it warranted. Louisa watched this from across the room and turned back to the stove before her face could do anything she didn't want it to do. In the evenings, after Kit slept, she and Callum worked through the documents together. He explained the survey methodology. She asked questions that made him pause, reassess, occasionally admit that she had identified something he had not fully thought through. She had finished 4 years of schooling in Ontario before her family moved west, which was more than most women in the settlement and more than she usually admitted, because admitting it had not historically made her life easier. They built the letter together over 5 evenings. It was precise, exhaustive, and devastating. It named every falsified filing and the specific dates of submission. It identified the discrepancy between the original 1881 survey, which Callum had obtained from the Dominion Archives in Calgary, and the amended filing that Haverstock had submitted in 1884. It documented the false lien instrument presented to Louisa with a witness-at account of a neighbor who had been present when Haverstock served it, and who Louisa was now fairly certain would sign a sworn statement if asked correctly. And it named Haverstock's visits to Thomas in the months before Thomas died. Not as proof of murder, Louisa was not foolish enough to make a claim she could not yet substantiate, but as a documented pattern of pressure, coercion, and financial intimidation that the NWMP would find very interesting as context once they began to look. On the 8th morning, the sky was hard and clear and blue, the kind of January cold that was honest about itself. Callum saddled his horse. The horse had spent the week in Louisa's shed eating her hay, which she could not really spare and which she had given it anyway. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. His shoulder was bound and he would be stiff for weeks, but the color had come back to his face and he moved without the guarded, tentative quality of a man managing pain constantly. "The report will go to the Superintendent of Lands in Edmonton," he said, "and a copy to the legal counsel for the CPR Land Acquisition Office, because they have standing to act on water rights fraud, and they have considerably more speed than government bureaucracy when their own money is involved. And the NWMP I'll stop at the detachment in Dunmore Crossing on the way east. Give them the relevant section in writing." He paused. "There's a constable there, Aldous. I know him from a previous survey dispute. He's thorough. He won't let Haverstock buy him." She nodded. Kit was standing beside her, with his arms crossed in careful imitation of her posture, watching Callum's horse with grave authority. "You'll be safe?" Callum asked. "I've been safe for 8 months with no one to ask," Louisa said. But she said it without the edge she might have used a week ago. "The documents are the danger. Once they're with you and out of this valley, there's nothing for Haverstock to take from me that matters." Callum looked at her. He was quiet for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll send word when the report is filed," he said. "I know you will." He put his hat on. He stepped down from the porch, then stopped with his boot on the second step and turned back. "The CPR contract," he said. "If the water rights revert to the correct registration, your registration, the compensation for access will be significant. Enough to clear any debt, real or invented, enough to make this farm what your husband intended it to be. He held her gaze. I'll make sure that's in the report. Louisa looked at him for a moment. The cold was sharp and clean, and the birch trees along the fence line were white as bone against the sky. Thank you, Callum, she said. He nodded. He mounted. He rode east through the gate, the document case strapped inside his coat, the original 1881 government survey safe in the saddlebag, and Louisa watched him until the trail bent through the spruce and he disappeared. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived on the mail coach from Edmonton. Everett Haverstock had been taken into custody by the Northwest Mounted Police on charges of land fraud, falsification of government survey records, and unlawful coercion. The Dominion Lands Office had voided the amended filing and restored the original 1884 registration, effective immediately. A second letter, on CPR letterhead, arrived the following week. The water access compensation offer was a figure that made Louisa sit down at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. She did not sell the land. She leased the water access on a 20-year term, on terms her Ontario-trained brain had negotiated back and forth in a week of letters that the CPR's legal office had clearly not expected from a homestead widow in the foothills. And in March, when the first thaw broke the ice on the Blackwater and the mud returned, and the world began its slow, reliable transformation back into something that wanted to be lived in, Louisa was on the porch with her coffee when she heard a horse on the South Trail. Kit heard it too. He came to the door with flour on his hands. He had taken enthusiastically to bread making that winter, a fact that had surprised them both, and looked out at the trail. "Is that Mr. Briggs's horse?" Kit said. Louisa had already recognized the gait. She had spent a week listening to that horse move in her shed. "Yes," she said. "Is he coming back to stay?" She did not answer immediately. She watched Callum ride through the gate, his coat open. In the March warmth, the winter gone from his face, he lifted his hat when he saw her on the porch. "I don't know yet," she said, but she did not go inside. She stood in the early spring sun with her coffee cooling in her hands and watched him come up the drive, and the Blackwater ran clean and high behind the property line, and overhead, for the first time since November, there were geese.